Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, everyone. You know the drill. We're always asking that same question.
Right.
Is there a link between creativity and mental illness?
Right.
And today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of, well, I'm sure you know who, Ludwig van Beethoven.
Of course. One of the greats.
We're going to be looking at a fascinating book by Francois Martin May called Diagnosing Genius, The Life and Death of Beethoven.
Yeah, this should be good.
Now, before we jump into the nitty-gritty, I want to throw this out there, something that really hooked me.
Okay, hit me.
Beethoven, he actually considered suicide because of his hearing loss. Can you imagine that?
Wow, no, I can't imagine. Talk about a struggle.
I know. And in this document called the Heiligenstadt Testament, he writes it all out, his despair, his anguish. It's truly heartbreaking, but it makes you wonder, did his struggles somehow fuel his genius?
It's such a good question.
That's what we're going to be exploring today.
I think to really understand Beethoven, we need to understand the world he lived in.
Like, set the stage.
Yeah, exactly. It's the late 1700s, early 1800s in Europe. Revolutions are erupting. The Enlightenment is challenging everything people thought they knew.
Right, like everything's changing.
And medicine is just starting to figure things out, taking those first baby steps.
It was a wild time. And May's book, it doesn't just tell us about Beethoven's life. It really throws him right into the middle of all of this chaos.
Exactly. Like, take the French Revolution.
Oh, yeah?
Beethoven, he was deeply affected by it. I mean, he saw Napoleon initially as a hero, he actually embodied those revolutionary ideals.
Right.
And he even dedicated his Eroica Symphony to Napoleon.
Symphony.
Exactly.
But then Napoleon, he does a total 180, declares himself emperor, basically ditches those ideals he was supposed to stand for.
Totally.
And Beethoven.
Oh, furious.
Yeah. I read he was so enraged that he actually ripped up the title page of the Eroica.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. But it makes sense.
Talk about passion.
It really shows you, how deep his beliefs ran, his commitment to those ideals of freedom and change. And you can hear that same passion in his music. It's raw. It's powerful. But there was more than just political upheaval happening back then.
Socially, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Huge social shifts.
Like Beethoven's own family, they moved from the Belgian countryside to Bonn and then on to Vienna, following these, huge waves of change sweeping across Europe.
Exactly. It was a time of massive upheaval. Think about it. Rigid class structures, they were starting to break down, and a new middle class is emerging.
Like a whole new world was being born.
Yeah, totally. And speaking of things that were a bit rough around the edges back then.
Medicine. Don't even get me started.
Yeah, we're talking bloodletting, purging. I mean, these were common treatments.
Can you imagine being Beethoven and having to go through that?
It makes you thankful for modern medicine, that's for sure.
Absolutely. But yet, it's interesting. Even then, there was this growing awareness of hygiene and natural remedies.
Yeah, right. Things like spas and exercise, fresh air. People were starting to make the connection between those things and good health.
It shows people have always been trying to find ways to feel better, even if sometimes, their methods were a little intense.
A little bit.
So we've got this backdrop of revolutions, political, social, and medical. And it's into this world that Ludwig van Beethoven is born, 1770, Bonn, Germany.
And his early life, it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. His father, a talented vocalist, he struggled with alcoholism.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, so you can imagine the home environment was, shall we say, a bit tumultuous.
Definitely. I mean, that must have had an impact. It really makes you think about the whole mad genius idea, doesn't it?
Yeah, did this difficult childhood somehow spark his creativity, or was it a source of lifelong struggle?
It's a tough question.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's clear that these early experiences, they often shape an artist's path, sometimes in profound ways.
For sure. And despite the chaos at home, Beethoven's musical talent, it was undeniable.
Mm.
And thankfully, he had patrons like the von Breuning family who saw his potential.
Oh, they were crucial.
Nurturing his education, making sure he had the opportunity to develop his gifts.
That patronage system back then, it was everything. Without the support of these wealthy individuals, who knows if Beethoven would have ever reached his full potential.
Imagine how different music history would be.
I know, right? It's crazy to think about.
And eventually, of course, he moves to Vienna.
The music capital of Europe.
Exactly. He wanted to take his career to the next level.
And he did. I mean, he achieved incredible success.
He did. But his personal life, Well, it was full of intense rivalries, romantic disappointments. It wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Not at all. And he never married,
Yeah,
but
right.
he did have these significant relationships with women.
And of course, there's the immortal beloved.
Oh, yes, the mystery woman. We still don't know who she was.
I know, right? It's still a mystery to this day.
But we do have these letters that he wrote to her. They're incredibly passionate, full of longing. It gives you a glimpse into his heart, a side of him that often gets overlooked when we focus only on his music.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
Oh, for sure.
We're not just talking about the genius, the Beethoven everyone knows. We're going deeper, trying to understand the man, the experiences that shaped him, the joys, the sorrows.
All of it. The whole picture.
And speaking of sorrows, we can't ignore this big thing looming over everything.
Yeah, you've got to talk about it.
Beethoven's health problems.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy suffered from so much. Colic, diarrhea, even eye inflammation, possibly fibromyalgia.
And then there's the deafness starting in his late 20s. Imagine losing a sense that's so vital to your art. I mean, that's got to be devastating.
Heartbreaking, really. And in the Heiligenstadt Testament, he even talks about thinking about suicide because of it. It's raw, it's honest, and it's really hard to read.
Yeah, it really makes you question, how he managed to keep going, keep composing with all that weight on his shoulders.
You mentioned earlier that doctors aren't even sure what caused his deafness. Like, what were the theories back then? Did they even have a clue what was going on?
Well, keep in mind, this is the early 1800s. Medicine was a whole different ballgame.
Right. So
They didn't have the tools, the knowledge. Some thought it could be otosclerosis, that affects the tiny bones in the ear. Others thought maybe typhoid fever or even, get this, syphilis.
syphilis.
Right.
Seriously, was there any evidence for that?
Not really. I mean, when they did the autopsy, there weren't any signs you'd typically see with syphilis. But here's where it gets interesting. They analyzed his hair, much later.
Oh, yeah. The hair can tell you things from the past.
Exactly, like a time capsule. And they found incredibly high levels of lead.
Wait, lead? Lead poisoning? How would he have even been exposed to that back then?
Well, remember how we talked about, the regulations for food and drink? There weren't really any. And get this, adding lead to wine was pretty common.
What? Why?
Crazy, right? They used it as a sweetener and a preservative. Imagine that.
No way. So his love of wine could have been slowly poisoning him. That's kind of ironic.
Yeah, it's a definite possibility. And lead poisoning, it can cause all sorts of problems. Hearing loss, digestive issues, even neurological problems. It could explain a lot, actually.
It's a tragic thought that something he enjoyed could have been hurting him. But even with the lead and all his other health issues, he still composed some of his most incredible music. How did he do that?
It's mind-blowing, right? His dedication, his willpower, it was incredible. But it wasn't easy. I mean, you read his letters, his journals, and you can really see how much he struggled. The isolation, the frustration, the anger.
It makes sense. His music must have been an outlet, a way to, channel all that pain into something beautiful.
Absolutely. His hearing loss, it forced him to adapt. He couldn't rely on his ears the same way anymore, so he had to find new ways to compose, new ways of hearing the music internally.
That's really interesting. And it connects back to that idea of cognitive flexibility you mentioned earlier. Do you think maybe his deafness actually pushed him to think more creatively?
That's what a lot of experts think. Losing one sense, maybe his others became sharper, especially his inner ear, his mind compensating for the loss. And maybe that opened up these new creative pathways. He wasn't limited by the traditional way of hearing and composing anymore.
Wow. That's a really powerful thought.
Yeah, it makes you think about, how our limitations can sometimes push us to innovate, to see things in a new way. But we can't forget, Beethoven wasn't just dealing with physical ailments. There's the whole question of his mental health, too.
Right. That was a big part of what this deep dive was going to be about.
Yeah, and aside from the lead and the stuff we know for sure he had, there's evidence to suggest he was dealing with depression, maybe even bipolar disorder.
Okay, so what makes them think that? What kind of evidence is there?
Well, we have the Heiligenstadt Testament, obviously. I mean, his despair is clear in that. But there are also all these letters and accounts from people who knew him. They talk about these wild mood swings.
Okay, so up 1 minute, down the next.
Exactly. Euphoric, energetic one day, irritable and withdrawn the next.
That's kind of a classic image of, the tortured artist. All that passion and intensity, but also these dark moods and unpredictable behavior.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, we can't diagnose him for sure, from all this time away. But the patterns in his life do line up with what we know about those conditions today.
So how does all of this connect to the whole mad genius idea? Like, if he did have these mental health struggles, did they fuel his creativity? Is that even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's hard to say definitively, but there's definitely something there to explore. We're finding out more and more about how certain mental states like hypomania, a milder form of mania, can actually boost creativity.
How so?
Think about it. Heightened energy, racing thoughts, making these unusual connections, all of those things could be really helpful in the creative process.
But earlier you were saying it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? That same intensity can lead to problems.
Oh, absolutely. Instability, relationship issues, even self-destructive behaviors, it can go either way.
And with Beethoven, we see both sides, right? He achieved these amazing things musically, but he also had all these struggles, conflict, money problems, isolation.
Yeah, his life seems like this constant battle, this push and pull between his creative fire and his inner demons.
And maybe that's why his music is so powerful. It's like
Yeah.
we're hearing the sound of someone grappling with the depths of human experience, the joy, the sorrow, the triumph, the despair, all of it.
It's real.
It reminds us that genius, it doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's shaped by a person's life, their experiences, the good and the bad.
Totally. And with Beethoven, those experiences were, well, let's just say they were intense.
Yeah. And he lived through this period of massive change, personal loss, these debilitating illnesses. And yet, through it all, he created some of the most incredible music the world has ever known. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
About what?
Like, would his music be the same without the struggles? If his life had been easier, would he have reached the same heights? We'll never know for sure.
It's impossible to say, but you can feel his spirit in the music, his resilience. He turned his pain into something transcendent, something that touches everyone. It's really pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it really is. His story challenges us to think differently about creativity, about how challenges can shape art, and about the link between genius and mental illness. We've covered a lot in this deep dive, but I think there's one more piece of the puzzle.
What's that?
The medical evidence, the autopsy, the hair analysis. What do those tell us about Beethoven's health and how he actually died? Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. We've been digging deep into the world of Beethoven, his life, his music, and of course, all those medical mysteries.
It's a fascinating puzzle.
Now, we keep talking about lead poisoning and all sorts of things, but what did they actually find when they examined his body after he died?
Well, the autopsy report is pretty detailed. It was done the day after he died, in 1827.
Wow, that's quick.
It gives us this really clear picture of what was going on inside, and let me tell you, it wasn't pretty.
Okay, like what?
They found his liver. It was shrunken, hard, his spleen was enlarged, and there was all this fluid buildup in his abdomen.
So signs of serious liver disease.
Oh yeah, advanced stages.
And we talked about those gallstones too. Did they find those?
Yep, confirmed in the autopsy. And those were probably the cause of those terrible bouts of colic he kept having.
Poor guy. It's like even a genius can't escape the fact that our bodies, these break down sometimes.
That's true.
But the autopsy, it's just one piece of the puzzle, right? I mean, then you have the hair analysis.
Yeah.
That was done centuries later. And it really threw a wrench into things.
Yeah, that was a game changer.
So those crazy high lead levels, they were real.
Oh yeah, incredibly high. Which means the lead poisoning theory, it's looking more and more likely.
But if that's true, why didn't they mention anything about it in the autopsy?
You got to remember, in the early 1800s, the idea of lead poisoning, it was just starting to be understood. Doctors wouldn't have recognized the signs as easily as we do today.
So they probably saw his symptoms and just blamed them on something else.
Exactly. It's like we're using modern science to solve this medical mystery from centuries ago.
It's wild, right? But beyond all the physical stuff, there's also his mental state. I mean, how did he deal with his declining health, the isolation from his deafness?
Well, his letters and journals, they paint a pretty bleak picture. You see the despair, the frustration, even anger.
Yeah, and it seems like he just withdrew from the world more and more.
He did. It was almost like his world was shrinking, literally and figuratively. Losing his hearing cut him off from everything.
Like he was trapped in silence. His genius, it must have been a blessing and a curse, all at the same time.
Absolutely. And yet, he never stopped composing. In fact, some say his greatest works came from those later years when his deafness was at its worst.
It almost makes you wonder, maybe being forced to turn inward, to rely only on his inner ear, made him even more creative.
Yeah, like he was exploring a whole new world of sound that no one else could hear.
It all comes back to the mad genius question, doesn't it? Were his struggles, the physical and the emotional, Were they somehow connected to his incredible talent?
It's a question that might never have a clear answer. But by looking at the evidence, at his life, his personality, we can start to understand him better, the man behind the music.
I think that's a good takeaway from all of this. Beethoven's story, it's more than just about music. It's about the human spirit, about the potential for greatness, and the reality of suffering.
And it shows that creativity can thrive even in the toughest conditions.
So the next time you hear Beethoven, don't just hear the music. Think about the man who created it, his struggles, his triumphs, and the impact he's had for centuries.
His music, it's a gift, a testament to what's possible when we push through the darkness.
This has been a fascinating deep dive, but like we always say, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep listening, and we'll catch you next time on the Mad Genius Thesis.